Sometimes they didn't use their heads very well, but they knew how to make things. And so when America was prospering in the factory age, they were key parts. They were cogs in that manufacturing. One uncle was a tinsmith. One uncle was a millwright. No, he wasn't a millwright. He was a molder in a Westinghouse subdivision. And the Wesley, the youngest of the boys, there were 4 boys, but along the early years, one little fellow, 5 years old, died of diphtheria. Wesley was a little more artistic of the 3 boys and managed a little A&P store until he went into the Army. But work, we understood work. And that's what I learned from my father.
And again, he worked at Westinghouse?
Yes, and I worked at Westinghouse.
Ah. Again, just for the record, what year were you born?
1918, December 1.
So right after, literally right after World War I.
That's right. As I said, my father was discharged from the Army, your word, and I was born. And for that reason, I was very close. The first boy born of these immigrant children, children from the immigrant parents. So I was a favorite grandchild. Mother's younger sisters treated me well, looked after me. I got along well with my grandfather, who wanted me to learn to speak Swedish, and I didn't take to that. So that's that part of it. It wasn't until about, well, let me say this. I went to grade school in Braddock for 2 years, and I have no recollection of a learning experience. I could remember, because there was 1 or 2 fellows in the class that either couldn't or wouldn't remember some poetry, and the teacher gave it to me, and I was able to remember it. But we moved to Sharon. The Westinghouse plant moved to Sharon. 65, 70 miles north. Started 3rd grade there, East Ward School. And because of scarce housing, families lived together. One family would rent the 1st floor, our family rented the 2nd floor. Housing was very short, and Westinghouse built 2 sections of houses, one in Sharon, one in Sharpsville, next little burg. You couldn't tell where you left one and entered the other. Well, it was about, I must remember, I had the childhood diseases, measles and so on. I maintain that the kids never played ball in the street as much and as well as when I had mumps looking out the window. I was envious of them. We played marbles to and from school in the gutter. Well, and one day we took jar rings from mason jars, cut them into little strips, and made little missiles, a rubber band, and shot the girls' legs. For that, I received a paddling. I think that was 4th grade. And when I got home, I had dishonored the family. So I really Mother really knocked me around. You don't do that thing. Our family was law-abiding, you know, the typical American wanting to do right thing. And you didn't do that kind of thing that you got punished for in school. No.
By the way, growing up in Braddock and Sharpsville, who was your baseball team? Who was your favorite team?
Well, only the Pirates, you know.
Did you ever go down to Forbes Field?
Yes, my father took me to a game. As a matter of fact, when the season opened, the opener they called it, he would take the afternoon off from work. And Mother had his better outfit laid out on the bed so he could come hurry home from work, get dressed, get a streetcar, and go out to Forbes Field. That was, you know, he never missed an opener.
Yeah, did he have a favorite player? Do you remember, did he talk about the Wainers or Wagner? Or...
Oh, Father knew them. He was a baseball fan to the nth degree. That never rubbed off on me. I listened and I knew the names. I remember the great trio of Connie Mack's A's, Simmons, and there were 3 of them, sluggers. Simmons, I can't remember the other 2 names. Well, no, baseball never caught me. No sport did. The reason why, I was small. I was a little kid. We moved to Sharon when I was 3rd grade. 4th grade, we moved 1 block up to a house from living on the 2nd floor of the large house. So I went to a different school. And to that school, the children from East Hill, Sharon, I call them the swells, came to school of Jefferson Avenue. And I won the school marble championship, have a little medal still. But when I went to the city marble tournament, I came in 3rd. Not to speak of. No mention of the 3rd. You either were 1st or you're nothing. But I was a teacher's pet in 5th grade, and I don't know why. My grandmother, Danielson, used to buy me a sweater and a nice pair of pants for school every year. We'd go to the famous store. Famous is a name in Braddock. In 6th grade, I had what I call my first learning experience. There was a school paper that we used to get, having any idea what the name was, but it became important to me because I understood the articles, and when quizzed about them, I could answer. And I felt elated about that. I called that a learning experience. And then we moved, that was 6th grade, we moved to this next little town, Sharpsville, into one of those homes that Westinghouse had built. So it was about 4 or 5 years old and much improved over what we had. Hardwood floors, still a working man's house, had a furnace, no coal stove, and in a nice neighborhood along the streetcar line. And we moved in August. And school started Labor Day, day after Labor Day. And I walked 1.1 miles from home to school. And that's the way it was until I was graduated. But I went to the school, didn't know a soul. Others were coming back. Sharpsville's a little town. It had a blast furnace where it employed men, of course, no women. They seated us, they seated us alphabetically in this homeroom. As I tell, there was Martin and there was McCann. Eileen, McCann. Very soon after school was started, the art teacher came, passed out papers and boxes of pencil crayons, the kind you could sharpen. And she said, take a color. She didn't say take a color. She said a specific color, like brown, I don't know. I didn't know color. I was embarrassed. I was faced with a dilemma. Either saying, I don't know colors. Who in the world doesn't know colors? How dumb can you be? I didn't want that to happen. So I cheated. I took my box of pencil crayons around to this little girl behind me. And I said, which one do I need? And she didn't say a word, she pointed to it. And I turned back. Those are the first words I said to Eileen. Then we were together through high school. A new fellow came to town by the name of Ted Coran. And of course the girls vied to be his special friend. And Eileen and he hit off and were very, very close all through high school. I was standoffish. I liked her. And I thought they would get married. but they didn't. He went to Penn State. She went out one weekend to visit him. I know this because there was a group of us at the same age in this little town, kind of tight-knit. You know, we kind of ran together. I don't know if they still do it, but the girls organized parties. Their mothers would bake a cake, and they would invite us fellows. And of course, this is where we learned to kiss. Post office, and so on. That was fun. And each time that happened, your hormones were stirred by a different girl. I know I went home liking this one, get home liking that one, but always liked Eileen. Well, Eileen was smart. She was an honor student. She had a difficult subject. I remember it well, about the rich and the poor, an echo of what we're hearing today, the difference. And she talked about that. She wanted her composition about choosing an occupation. She wanted to be an undertaker. So she queried the undertaker in town. That's the kind of a girl she was. Took piano lessons and played for some of the smaller groups that sang. Her friend played for the orchestra. Then about sophomore year, by the way, I still thrilled to learn. I loved learning. They asked me if I would take lessons on the school's viola. And my parents, of course, they didn't have to buy it. All they had to do was pay 50 cents a week to take the lesson. That was a music teacher. Well, I couldn't play it, but it was a filler in the little orchestra. The viola is a kind of a sub-instrument, lovely when it's played well. So I think a couple years I did that, but my heart wasn't in it. I never really practiced. But I did take mechanical drawing, and I warmed to that. As a matter of fact, of the class of boys who did, some of my friends who were grade conscious didn't take it because the first grade of the class, he got a D. A couple friends, Claude Miller, ultimately became a mailman. He quit. It was too much for him. I persevered. I think I got a D too, but I loved the idea of drawing and the preciseness of it. And I got sufficiently proficient in the 4 years that I was doing, what would you call it? Doggone it. There's a word for it. perspective. Teacher would showed me a house, and I would make a perspective of it. 30 degrees this way, 30 degrees that way, and so on. So I really enjoyed that. Took French, Latin first, and then French as junior and senior year. Well, what to do when you graduated from school? The worst time in my life was right after graduation. I thought I'd lose my mind. At the far end of town, my friends were on the way to school. The folks wanted me to clean wallpaper, which didn't help my situation. So Dad came home from work and said, there's a job opening painting company houses. He said, now if you he was especially protective. If you feel you don't want to do this or can't do this, climbing ladders, said you don't have to. But in those days, the scheme of things was pretty much the younger fellows would get jobs if they could, and this provided an asset to family fortune. And that's the way it was. The Depression was ending, jobs were opening up. I was painting houses. The painter, I was the assistant, of course. The painter was a man of the world. And during that season of painting, from June 9 until the middle of October, we painted 14 houses. And I learned to walk the plank between the ladders. There were ladder jack. You covered one side of the house, 3 ladders. He was a man of the world, if you know what I mean. He told me stories that are not repeatable.
So don't listen.
A good fellow, family man, but he had played football for the Canton Bulldogs. And he was tough, What
was his name?
Raymond. That's all I can remember now. Raymond, maybe it'll come to me. Well, when the painting season was over, I didn't know what to do. There were some young fellows who were going to college in Youngstown. Youngstown had developed a night school, Youngstown College. I think it's a university now. Every school wants to be a university. But, so I found out about them. I tried Penn State extension courses. Excuse me. One winter, I went to a Penn State extension course. And then I tried a business course. We had no typing in high school, so I became acquainted with typing. shorthand baffled me. Couldn't get it. So I was pleased when this opportunity to go to Youngstown College came along, and I went for 3 years, night school. And we always tried to get a girl. We took turns driving. Always tried to get a girl or two to go along, 5 fellows. An advanced course in drawing at Youngstown College, and I took, providentially, what would be a freshman year's requirements. I took chemistry, I took economics, I took public speaking, I took English, I took mathematics, and over 3 years, that was my corpus of curricula, so to speak. Now, all the time, I was very active in young people's work in the church, Presbyterian Church, and had formed I think a rather unique relationship to Mr. Woods, our minister. I said to myself, is this what a man looks like? I want to be like that. He was bright, he was articulate, he, not too much to look at, he was aged, of course. But in the same way my father introduced me to work. For example, my father said, if you're watching someone doing and he needs a hammer, don't have him ask you, anticipate it and give it to him. Well, in the same way, Mr. Woods introduced me to things of the Spirit. I thought he was a great preacher, not the caliber we're getting here, but a great preacher, never used notes. He had a farm outside of town. He came off a farm, went to Washington and Jefferson, and I became a very close friend of his. Well, now Eileen was the organist, so I see her off and on, you know. So that's the way our friendship was. Then, when I finished painting houses, the shop opened up, and I was assigned a clerk to a welding group. Excuse me. A small welding group that made plot heads for the sides of transformers, big ones. They built the kind of transformers that went out to Boulder Dam for power, big power. Tons. Took 2 big cranes to lift them down. Well, a lot of little parts get lost, so I was a checker trying to find these parts for the pothead group. But at the same time, what was going on in the shop fascinated me. So I coaxed them until they relented and taught me how to weld. I became acquainted with shop practice, drilling, machining, everything. Very much at home there. But I was also interested in those years in the church. Mr. Woods asked me to be Sunday school superintendent. I was so dumb that one morning he said to me, "Warren, I wouldn't sing a Sunday school hymn about evening in the morning." So that's the way I learned, you know. Faux pas, having things pointed out to me. Well,
And all along, Eileen's part of that world of yours.
oh yes, I see her often, you know, in the church with be some planning. I'd be a part of it. And one time they had a Halloween party, a little modest kind of thing. And I found at home an old sheet, and Mother had a big brass safety pin. So I made a diaper. I looked like Gandhi. So I was the hit of the party that night. Well, I went to the drawing room from the shop where I learned how you do those things and worked for 3 years at the drawing board. That was interesting. And what I learned was when the shop people had a picnic, I would go to it. And when the engineering department had a picnic, I went to it. Under the skin, they were the same. Even though engineers and draftsmen had a kind of an elevated style of language in the shop, if you wanted to get the craneman, you cursed at him.
Yeah.
So, well, one day on the drawing board, I don't know if you've been in a drawing, an office where there are a large number of drawing boards, and the draftsmen are bent over them, and sometimes they put their head up wondering what to do next, you know. And I had my head up, and I never even told this story to Eileen, which I find regrettable. The words came to me, "He who would seek to find his life will lose it. But if he gives his life to the gospel and to me, he will find it." That's when I decided to go into the church. So I told Mr. Woods that one October evening, and he said, "Where will you go to school?" And I said, "I haven't given it the slightest idea. Night school would not fit me for that, you know." I said, "Where'd you go to school?" He said, "W&J." I said, "That's good enough for me." So we made an appointment to go down and see the president that following spring. The president, he was the youngest college president at the time. Let's see. Ralph Cooper Hutchison. Tall, good-looking fellow. We sat in his office for a while, talked. So the way was for me to go to W&J the following fall. That's what happened. I went down in September, and they didn't know quite what category I fit in. I wasn't really a freshman beginning, but I wasn't very far along, so I was a social sophomore. And I had an advisor, Professor Pritchard, in the Greek and Classics department. Now, W&J is a small school, so he filled many positions, you know, taught Greek and Latin and was the classics man, the Greek classics, and so on. Well, we hit it off well. His father was a Reformed minister, and I knew he would be a little conservative. That's the way I was at the time. So we put together a class, and he said, I want to see the transcript from Youngstown before we talk about courses in Greek. He came back, he said, yeah, you'll do well. So we took on a full load. Now, at this time, the war was coming on, and I had a draft number, 5,800 and something, pretty high. So while I was down at W&J that first year, many of our boys, our friends, all the boys' school, it's co-ed now. We had to have our medical exam, and that's when it was really verified I was colorblind. They had the dot, there's a name for it, the dot with numbers woven in and letters. I couldn't read them. Couldn't see the numbers in the dot. So I knew that was my problem, really. Well, I got along well.
By the way, did you feel a little bit bad about not being able to go into the service? How'd you feel about that? Were many of your friends living here? No?
I'll tell you along a little bit here. I had this first full year, then they started accelerating, and we went to school all summer, never stopped. And then the fall, and then I had become a member of the Beta fraternity, only because a friend of mine the boys who had started freshman, sophomore, junior, they had enough credits that W&J could have a first-time midterm commencement. So I went to see the dean. I didn't want to be left out if it's possible. And he said, you'll need 21 more credits to graduate in December. 42, but the class of 43. I said, fine. So I signed up for 7 courses, and that's how I became a member of the class of 43, but graduating in 42. I graduated with honors, and I don't tell this to anybody, really. I was elected. I was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. So I had a call from the board, the service board, the draft board. And I was ready to go to seminary. And it was at this point where I would go to the service or go to seminary. And they said, you can go to seminary. So I went to seminary. So I had no feelings about some of my friends went into chaplaincy programs. I didn't. My brother was in the service. He ended up in Kodiak Island. So that's my story at that point.
I just got to ask one question. Do you remember December 7th, 1941?
Sure, I was studying Greek. I didn't have a radio, but it was we had a big old dormitory, and the word came out. They had bombed Pearl Harbor. But I was doing my Greek lesson. Yes, I remember it well.
Was there a conversation among the students?
No, not among the group. I had a roommate, but we didn't gather together. Maybe some did, but I wasn't a part of it.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
So next thing, you're on your way to the seminary?
Yes. Went to Western Seminary at that time on the north side. And they assured, there were 7 of us, they assured the 7 of us that they would fit us into their program because we were mid-termers. Well, we did. We sat with the fellows and one girl, and she was only a part-time student, who had begun in September. And we were mightily perplexed. The language was different because most of us were Greek majors. I was a Greek English major. There wasn't the Greek classes that bothered us. It was the history classes and the theology, especially the theology classes. So a couple of us remonstrated with the dean and said, it's not working. Another fellow had been writing to Princeton to see what they were doing with mid-termers. When they saw those letters going back and forth, they said, well, we'll see if we can accommodate you. But in the meantime, we made some of the faculty angry. We upset their nice plan, you know. One professor called us the obstreperous minority. But we worked out so that they would start us from scratch. We were a little class while the other classes went on, and we finally caught up and graduated with the class of 45. So seminary was very interesting and very enlightening because most of us were like farmers right off the farm, no sophistication about any of these subjects. You know, Adam and Eve were still real to us. And we finally learned that wasn't quite so. Then, by this time, Eileen had made a choice. And the boy whom she had gone to see at Penn State, she told him, I should be marrying Warren Martin. She didn't say that to me. I learned this afterwards. And it turned out the woman chooses. And she chose me.
How did you find out about that?
About which?
Well, at some point you had this conversation and she disclosed that you were the preference.
I learned that through a back channel, as they say. A friend of Eileen with whom she had shared this. The friend told me that. So we started at that time going steadily and set a date in mid-school term, my senior year, New Year's Eve, that's when we got married, and I had a couple of months to go to get my degree and find a church. And that's the way it was. But I loved her always. I sometimes wonder if she had married someone else, what I would have done. I can't imagine life without her. Can't imagine. So, like the migrants from Georgia and Alabama, Cleveland is where we spent our honeymoon. One weekend. That's the joke in our family. You went to Cleveland on your honeymoon by train. We got to the hotel, no reservation. Oh, fortunately, I had the telegram confirmation. Then they found a room. And then we had a call to the church in the country where we stayed for 7 years, where all of our children were born. And in a big house, a big old man's. By the time I spent 7 years there, I was making $2,500 a year. That was the lowest pay in the Presbytery, I guess. Then a little church from Reynoldsville on 322 in Jefferson County had a committee, ministerial committee. And one of our kids had gotten chicken pox, and I got it. I was in pajamas when they came, full of scabs.
Okay.
I said to Eileen, they'll never be back. Well, in about 3 months or less, they were back. By that time, I was healed over, and they offered me a call. And of course, the salary went from $2,500 to $36,000. which was a big jump for us. 5 years in Reynoldsville. I would say the best 5 years of my ministry. Small town. I was asked to preach at every group in the town. I was a fair preacher. I could put together a sermon, not as good as Lundblad, but interesting enough to keep people's interest. And at one youth gathering, I became interested in youth work in the Presbytery. One year at one of the rallies, I was known as Mr. Reynoldsville. Well, we stayed there 5 years. And I might say something about that. When I went there, have you been in an old rural church? Mm-hmm. If it's an old one that hasn't been tampered with in any way, you know what it looks like. Pulpit-centered, stained glass windows, not Tiffany, but Tiffany-like. Seating about 200 people. I got the idea that we should have a different chancel. And I did a terrible thing. I undertook, without consulting the session, to make a drawing of a new chancel, circulated among the congregation. One couple responded with a $5 check. That was before I knew you had to promote these things, like growing a seed. So nothing was happening. I went into Butler, the next city, next town of any consequence, to a hardware store and bought a bandsaw and a table saw. Now you understand, those were two instruments that my father wouldn't know what to do with because they weren't in our house. He had no workbench even. You wanted to make a hole in a piece of wood, you drilled a nail and made it wiggle. That's how brash I was. In 2 years, I built the chancel for that church. And now they talk about it as being the nicest chancel of any little church around. Well, Reynoldsville was wonderful. Our kids grew in a neighborhood of kids. I had a good ministry, didn't have an enemy. I don't remember anybody being angry at me. There was a fellow by the name of Jack Sutter who had a welding shop. And he allowed me to come out and weld, you know. And we became good friends. Another fellow owned a burial case company, the Pennsylvania Burial Case Company. And Scott Vandervoort was president. Had a very invalid life, whom I was pretty faithful in visiting. He said, if you want some nice cherry wood, let me know. Well, I had the idea of building furniture, a dining room suite. So I drew up a bill of material. And he got me some nice cherry gift, you know. Then we left there and went to Apollo. That's when Tom was ready for first grade. And Eileen never really had a discussion with her, but when she came home shortly after we were there and said, Martha, Greg, and I went to Indiana and registered as part-time students. Martha Gregg dropped out about 6 weeks. Eileen persisted. 4 years later, including summer classes and so on, she got her degree and started to teach. Her first salary is $4,400. She taught for 21 years. Yeah, 21 years. And then we moved to Beaver. At the Apollo Church, I was beginning to rethink my seminary education. And others of my fellow clergy in the church, Presbyterian Church, were doing the same thing. So we formed a group, went to the seminary, and asked a professor to name some books we should read. There were half a dozen of us. And we would read the books and go in and meet with them. That's what started me to revise my theology, rethink it. All of our professors at seminary, excepting one who was a graduate of the Harvard Graduate School, all of the other professors had their educations in Europe, at Leipzig, Zurich, and London. So I didn't think we got really a fair shake. It was good, solid stuff, but no ideas entertained that I remember. So we did this. And pretty soon the seminary started a continuing education program. And I think it stemmed from our going down and talking to professors. And they did. Of course, continuing education is very big now. So from Apollo, we went to Beaver. Beaver's a county seat, and Beaver was the hub of the county that, in a sense, managed the county. All of the little industries around Beaver Valley, industrial, were members, mostly of the Presbyterian Church, but other churches too. They controlled the county. I think there were 3 judges in the congregation, an armful of lawyers, the superintendent of schools was there, high-powered outfit.
What was the name of the church?
First Presbyterian Church of Beaver.
Beaver?
And it was, I said, high-powered. She says it's a real going church now. They built one big building behind the other. Well, the kind of ministry that I provided was, there's a phrase that would cover that, persona non grata. I went to the March on Washington in '63, and Eileen and I went to another March on Washington while I was there. They didn't like that kind of thing. The present ministry would not go to marches like that. That's the kind of difference, see. My concept of the church is you don't come to the church, you learn what being the church is, and then you go out as the church. This concept is you come to the church and stay there. Now, that may be an incorrect, but that's the way I see it. So, and they provide a great ministry, but not for me. You know, not for me.
Did you and Eileen, what did Eileen do? She was teaching school throughout this time period, right?
Yes.
Yes. And then...
She had her friends,
yep.
And it was providential that she created a life of her own apart from being the wife of the pastor. She had a persona that didn't relate to me.
Yeah.
You understand what I mean?
Right. I have a wife like that, yeah. So.
Yeah, well, and she was a #1 teacher also. I want to tell you a few things about her, and I want to talk about Eileen. Her classroom, I helped her put up curtains, make it look like home. And when kids would come in with chapped lips, she had a jar of mentholatum, which is part of our family's history, and get each little kid, 4th graders, give them a treatment. And the first thing you know, there was a line. Nobody wanted to be left out of Eileen's treatment. She was a superb teacher and much loved by her students, and had friends with fellow students as well, greatly admired by them. Well, I regret some things. When we came to retirement, I said, Eileen, retire with me. And she said, I'd like to teach another year or so. And I persuaded her to retire with me. I regret that. That was terrible. I should not have done that. The best I could have done was say, Eileen, you make up your mind, and then she would have been free. I made a mistake there. She loved to teach. She was a #1 teacher. So, when I moved to where I am now in Telhai, the retirement home, the first thing I did was to establish a scholarship in her name at Indiana University at Indiana, PA, for married women, much like Eileen was, with family, to help them in their last year. And that's inaugurated now, and the first recipient has been given.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
How did you connect to Chautauqua?
Oh. Beaver was more affluent than many families from Beaver. one, there's Harold Reed over here, has a, do you know Harold Reed? Yeah. Well, he was a member of the congregation where I was. And in his, I think the elder Reeds built that cottage or bought that cottage that he has now. His brother was a lawyer too. One time was state commissioner of insurance in Pennsylvania. Well, Eileen and I explored it, liked it, kept coming back. And when the Borg Crossan team came, we couldn't believe how fortunate we were to hear those theologians. You couldn't keep us away. And I have Borg's books and Crossan's books. And we became friends with them. They're not really social friends, but we knew each other, you know. I took them to breakfast one time. So that helped shape my inclination to liberal thinking and progressive thinking, and that's where I am.
Is that why you established the funding for this week's program?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that came first. That was almost 10 years old now. And I thought it was shameful to name it the Warren, Martin, and Eileen. It's named Eileen and Warren. I didn't know at the time I was going to do that at Indiana, but she still deserved to be the giver of that lectureship, Eileen. And at Indiana, those who received the gifts are Eileen Martin scholars.
Perfect.
Well, now there's one little bit of a story. When I was about 55 or 56, I retired when I was 63. There was a death in my father's side of the family, and so we were drawn into that. And I discovered by accident, trying to get in touch with a cousin, a daughter of my father's brother. And I couldn't find Martin. So I called my aunt, with whom we had a relation. She lived in Youngstown. She would come to Sharon, we would visit her in Youngstown. And I said, Stella, I can't find Eleanor Martin in the telephone directory. Well, that's not her name. Her name is Gordish. I said, what do you mean? Uncle Jack's name was Martin. Dad's name was Martin. Why wouldn't a daughter be Martin? She says, your name is Martin, and hung up on me. So I had to sort out what this Gordish business was. That was my grandparents' name when they came to this country, in Johnstown, probably as coal miners. There's a couple of big tombstones with Gordic, and when you anglicize it, it becomes Gordish. So we had some relationship with the children of that couple, but I never knew my grandmother. My father was somehow, he just didn't do it for us.
Yeah.
Well,
Did you ever find the answer of why Martin?
I don't know how they came to that.
Yeah.
His two sisters adopted that name. And I think maybe because the elder sister chose the name Martin first, either through marriage or a choice. And Dad understood if you had a name from Southern Europe, Central Europe, to get a job, you were going to be like a second-class citizen. You better be anglicized. He did have a job on the little dinky engine as just a kid. As I said, he never finished grade school, but when he was able to work, he got a job as an engineer on a dinky engine that ran in the yard, moving steel around, Johnstown, Steel Town. And the engineer and the fellow who shoveled the coal in never got off the engine. They had to go to the bathroom. You defecated in the shovel.
Yeah.
That was too much for my father, and he quit. He had enough of a machinist understanding for him and his friend to go up through machine shops along Lake Erie. Every town had a machine shop. If you didn't like the boss, you quit. So he had a little bag of tools. And Elyria, Ashtabula, and those towns up along Lake Erie. He did that, and then he came back to the East Pittsburgh area, and I guess they met at a dance. Dad was a good dancer. My father was a good dancer, and Mother was too, in their younger days. And that's the story. It's as simple as it is.
Fantastic. All right, so Hannah, 25 years from now, Hannah's going to be asked at Chautauqua to give a little talk about her grandpa and grandma whose names are on this lectureship this week. What would you like her to say about you and your wife?
Well, let me put it this way. Eileen was a lover. Some of us as people make a decision, conscious or maybe unconsciously. But Eileen somehow chose consciously to be a lover. She loved people, and other people want to be loved. Nothing wrong with either of them, excepting the people who are lovers get hurt. Well, I would say, Hannah would say, I knew my grandparents as loving people, hard workers, but loving people. And she could say, sometimes they didn't make a damn bit of sense.
This has been great. It's great. I know you've got to run, but let's take a picture of the two of you here. You can get my iPhone out of here.
I was just listening and
Good job, Pop.
identical.
What?
Good job, Pop.
Oh, I don't
Pictures, Coal
know.
miners, my grandfather, my uncle, everything. Going down the steel mills, my whole family came over on the boat with the name change.
Do you?
Martins everywhere.
Okay,
Take a
well,
picture before he can get yelled at. We're gonna get yelled at.
All right, here we go. And 10. Big smile. Here we go. All right, another one. One more. Here we go. Perfect.
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Well, she makes
Thank
it look
you.
even better. You're
Thank
beautiful.
you. This is terrific. Just
Thank
terrific.
you very much.